The international terminal at Heathrow buzzed with its usual chaos. Families hurrying to their gates, business travelers typing frantically on laptops, and tourists juggling passports and duty-free bags. In the middle of it all, Aiden Baptiste moved calmly through the crowd. Tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with quiet confidence, he looked like any other passenger preparing for an overseas flight. To the people who didn't know him, he was simply another face in the sea of travelers. To those who did, he was far more than that. Aiden wasn't just a traveler. He was a respected financial strategist and a keynote speaker scheduled to address a major conference in New York. His work had earned him international recognition, and his insights on global economics were sought after by governments and corporations alike. Yet none of that mattered in this moment. To a few watching eyes at the gate, none of his achievements could shield him from suspicion. Sitting nearby was Veronica Hale, a woman with an inflated sense of entitlement who prided herself on being observant, though her observations often leaned heavily into bias. When her eyes fell on Aiden, she instantly drew conclusions not based on facts, but on prejudice. Seeing a black man in a first-class boarding line with expensive luggage was enough to make her uneasy. Whispering to an attendant, she implied that something seemed off about him, planting the seed of doubt where none should have existed. It didn't take long before two uniformed officers, Sergeant Raleigh and Officer Watson, approached Aiden. The contrast between them was striking. Raleigh was older, hardened by years on the force, and carried himself with the rigid authority of someone who believed his instincts were beyond question. Watson, younger and quieter, followed his lead but with a noticeable unease in his eyes. "Sir," Raleigh said brusquely, stepping in front of Aiden, "we're going to need to see some identification." Aiden looked surprised but remained composed. "Of course," he replied, pulling out his passport and boarding pass. Instead of easing the situation, Raleigh scrutinized the documents with exaggerated suspicion, as if expecting them to be fraudulent. Veronica, watching from her seat, smirked, pleased that her unfounded concerns were being taken seriously. Watson glanced between the papers and Aiden, his brow furrowed. Everything appeared legitimate, but Raleigh seemed intent on pushing further. "Step aside, sir," Raleigh ordered. "We'll need to ask you a few more questions." Other passengers began to notice. Murmurs spread as Aiden, despite his calm cooperation, was pulled aside near the gate. He knew what this was. Not about missing paperwork or suspicious behavior, but about perception. As Raleigh's tone grew sharper, Watson shifted uncomfortably. Something about the whole encounter didn't sit right with him. Still, protocol and loyalty to his partner kept him silent, for now. What began as one woman's baseless suspicion was about to spiral into an incident that would reach far beyond the walls of Heathrow Airport. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder as Sergeant Raleigh's voice carried. Without warning, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them around Aiden's wrists. The metallic click echoed, drawing gasps from onlookers. Aiden stood motionless, stunned not by the cuffs themselves, but by the indignity of being treated like a criminal in front of a crowd. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with disbelief. "Standard procedure," Raleigh barked, as if the phrase alone justified the humiliation. Passengers stopped what they were doing to watch. Phones appeared in hands, cameras quietly capturing every detail of the unfolding scene. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others whispered about how unfair it looked. Veronica, however, sat straighter, satisfied that her suspicions had led to action. Watson followed behind as Raleigh led Aiden through the terminal toward a restricted room. He glanced at the phones recording them, a flicker of unease passing across his face. Everything about this felt wrong. Still, he said nothing. Inside a stark interrogation room, Aiden was ordered to sit. Raleigh stood with folded arms, firing questions rapidly. Where was he traveling? What was the purpose of his trip? Did he really own the luggage he carried? The tone wasn't one of curiosity but of accusation, as though Raleigh had already decided the answers would be lies. Aiden answered calmly, his voice measured and steady. "I've already provided my documents. I am en route to New York to speak at an international finance summit. My credentials are in the bag you haven't checked yet. Raleigh sneered. You expect me to believe that? Watson shifted uncomfortably. He had quietly reviewed Aiden's passport earlier, and everything was valid. He wanted to say something, but Raleigh's domineering presence kept him silent. The senior officer's authority pressed down like a weight, and Watson feared the consequences of contradicting him. Outside the room, the story was already spreading. The passengers who had filmed the handcuffing uploaded the footage online. Within hours, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Heathrow incident and hashtag flying while black. The clip showed a composed black man being cuffed without resistance, contrasted against an aggressive officer whose actions seemed unjustified. By the time Raleigh was still demanding explanations inside the room, the outside world had already started demanding answers of him. Aiden sat tall, refusing to let frustration bend his posture. Sergeant, what you're doing right now isn't about safety, he said, his eyes steady. It's about perception, and perception can be wrong. Raleigh leaned forward, his jaw tight. Watch your tone. You're in no position to lecture me. But Raleigh was wrong. The man across from him was in a far stronger position than he realized. The balance of power was about to shift, and when it did, the humiliation Raleigh thought he was inflicting would come crashing back onto himself. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and in stepped Agent Declan, a senior official from airport security. His sharp eyes swept the scene. The handcuffed man seated calmly at the table, the tense young officer in the corner, and Raleigh looming with a scowl. Declan had already been briefed by staff outside, but seeing it firsthand made his blood run cold. Sergeant Raleigh, Declan said sternly. What exactly is going on here? Raleigh straightened, trying to mask his unease. Standard protocol, sir. The passenger was acting suspiciously. We're verifying his identity. Declan's gaze hardened. Suspicious? Or convenient? Because from what I've seen, the only thing suspicious is your judgment. He turned to Aiden, who met his eyes with calm composure. Mr. Baptiste, my apologies. This should never have happened. Raleigh blinked, taken aback. You know him? Declan pulled a document folder from under his arm and placed it on the table. Inside were details of the upcoming New York summit. At the top of the list of keynote speakers was Aiden Baptiste's name, alongside his photograph. This man, Declan said sharply, tapping the page, is not only a respected financial strategist but one of the primary speakers at the Global Economics Forum. Governments and industry leaders are waiting to hear him address world policy. And you've handcuffed him like a petty thief. The room fell silent. Watson's eyes widened in shock, while Raleigh's face drained of color. He stumbled over his words. I didn't know. His behavior was perfectly normal, Declan cut in. The only abnormality here is yours. Aiden finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Sergeant, what you saw as suspicion was nothing more than me standing in a line I paid for, carrying luggage I bought, and holding a passport that proves my right to travel. The problem isn't me. It's the assumptions you made. Watson lowered his gaze, shame written across his face. He had known deep down that this was wrong, but he hadn't had the courage to step in. Declan's words only confirmed it. Outside the room, things were moving fast. The video of Aiden's public handcuffing was gaining traction worldwide. By now, thousands of comments condemned the treatment he had endured. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, calling it an example of racial profiling at one of the busiest airports in the world. Veronica, the passenger whose complaint had sparked the fiasco, watched the headlines from her seat near the gate. As she realized the man she had falsely accused was not only innocent but a high-profile figure with global reach, her smug satisfaction dissolved into dread. The incident was no longer a quiet misunderstanding. It was a public scandal in the making. And at its center stood Sergeant Raleigh, whose by the following week, the Heathrow incident had become international news. Clips of Aiden being handcuffed while remaining calm circulated across every major platform, sparking outrage. Commentators pointed to it as another stark example of racial profiling, and protests began brewing outside the airport. Under immense pressure, Heathrow officials announced a full investigation into the officer's conduct. Sergeant Raleigh, once so confident in his authority, now found himself summoned to court. The video evidence left little room for excuses. In the courtroom, his attempt to defend his actions unraveled quickly. "I was following procedure," he insisted, but the judge cut through the defense with icy clarity. "Procedure does not mean targeting innocent travelers based on bias," the judge ruled. "What you demonstrated was not law enforcement, but prejudice." Officer Watson also testified, admitting his discomfort with the situation. His honesty spared him from the harshest penalties, but he was still reprimanded for failing to intervene. Raleigh, however, was not so fortunate. He was suspended without pay pending disciplinary review, with his future in law enforcement hanging by a thread. As for Veronica Hale, the passenger whose baseless suspicion had set the ordeal in motion, she too faced consequences. Once the media identified her, her name trended online but not with praise. She was condemned for weaponizing her prejudice and causing unnecessary harm. Companies she had ties with began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Overnight, her social standing crumbled. In the middle of it all stood Aiden. Though wronged, he refused to let bitterness guide him. When reporters swarmed him for comments, he didn't lash out. Instead, he addressed the deeper issue. "This was never just about me," he said at a press conference. "It's about every traveler who has been treated with suspicion for no reason other than the color of their skin. That must change." His words struck a chord. Soon after, Aiden announced a new initiative, a partnership with international travel authorities to train airport staff on cultural sensitivity and anti-bias practices. Funded partly by his own foundation, the program aimed to ensure that no one else would endure what he had. The announcement shifted the narrative. Aiden was no longer seen only as the victim of an unjust arrest, but as a reformer turning personal pain into progress. His efforts gained global recognition, inspiring similar initiatives at airports across Europe and North America. Meanwhile, Sergeant Raleigh's name faded from the headlines, remembered only as the officer whose arrogance ended his career. Veronica disappeared from public view, her reputation permanently scarred. But Aiden's name lived on, not just as a keynote speaker at financial summits, but as a voice for justice and dignity. In the end, what had begun as an act of prejudice at a departure gate became the spark for change, proof that integrity and resilience could transform even humiliation into legacy. Ance had just set his entire career on the verge of collapse.